welcome to our final webinar in 2024 as we finish up our Road to Resilience learning series. Today we're going to talk about workplace resilience and looking at, when you look at our theme for the year, is this where we want to be? Meaning, do we want to be where do we want to be working from is pretty much the theme here. And looking at how flexible is our workplace, how productive is it, and does it meet your needs for collaboration? I am Linda Nelson. I have been your speaker this entire year. I'm kind of excited. Next year we're going to have some guest speakers and do kind of a a webinar / podcast type of presentation. We are working on that still, but I am the founder and president of ICOR, and I am presenting to you today. If this is your first webinar of the year, you've missed most of our Road to Resilience learning series. If it is not, and you have listened to some of them, you can also watch them on demand. You can get them on our website by just clicking on the View Past Webinars. We also have them posted on our YouTube. And if you'd like to earn the badge, just send an email and we will add that you've completed it. So we've covered all these topics this year, from where do we want to go, who's in charge of planning, who's going to be part of the journey, kind of the roles and responsibilities, how do we manage our journey if the road is closed or you get a roadblock. What about when some of those people that you've decided that'll be on the journey decide to get what we're calling it motion sickness, but in reality kind of decide, well, I'm not so sure if I want to continue. Looking at other disruptions you might have on your journey, taking a minute to figure out what we've learned so far, taking a look to see how are we doing, have we met our missions and objectives for this. And today we're going to finish off with looking at kind of, are we in the right place to do the best work that we can, and is this where we want to be? Do see a question, so let me, hopefully you guys are, is there anyone else not seeing the slides transition? I'm just pausing here for a minute. It actually looks like it is showing the wrong slide. So give me 1 second to figure this out. My apologies. All right, so give me a second. I don't know what's happening, and this has never been an issue before. I think what I did is I paused and never restarted again. All right. Thank you for letting me know that. And it looks like you're now in the right place. I'm going to just go ahead and continue with this. And I'll probably just re-record it. I just don't want you to lose the time that you have. So part of the question that we're asking is how flexible and productive is our workplace in the way that we're working, and is it meeting our needs for collaboration? So we're going to be starting with looking at some workplace design and determining that balance between what we call we and me, looking a little bit backwards in history as well. Then we're going to look at what is a flexible hybrid working model for working, looking at things like where, when, and how people do their best work, looking at inclusive collaboration, and looking at how our teams interact, both within each team as well as with other teams. How often do they need to interact? And also understanding how do we manage teams when we have people that aren't in the same space that we are. And then finally, really concluding with a topic that's near to my heart, which is looking at community resilience and the fact that no matter where our offices, I'll call them, for most of you, reside, they're going to be part of some sort of community, and that community is going to impact your workforce resilience as well. Just remember, like always, the recording will be available in a couple of days. please keep using that questions button if we have any other technical issues, that, especially ones that are caused by the speaker. And we should have some time to answer questions. We won't be having any polls this time. But if you do have a question anytime through, please feel free to post it, and I can always pause and take a look at it. And just a reminder that you need to have attend for 35 minutes in order to get your certificate of attendance. So let's take a little look back in history. And depending how old you are, I know none of you were around in 1726, but I did think it was pretty ironic that the first office building built in London in 1726, the old I don't know how to say that, Admiralty office in London, really doesn't look that much different from buildings of today, where they had separate rooms for bosses and clerks, and then they had the open office space. And here you see in the late 1800s, like people just working side by side on those typewriters. Can you just imagine shoulder to shoulder, back to back? And so then we moved to the 1900s, and people are like, we need a little more space. And I actually pretty much liked this space that they're showing here. AT&T had a building very much like this, just north of Chicago, for lots and lots of years. I thought it was the coolest building ever. It was very 60s, and this is why I was kind of surprised to see this was actually before the 60s. But notice how they're managing the noise with the ceilings and the open space between people working. I actually thought that retro look was kind of cool. But then in the 60s through the early 80s, we moved to also what I think looks very similar to many of your office spaces now, which was putting a few walls up around. So you'll see in the having people have more space earlier on, they weren't really separated by anything. And so people wanted a little bit more privacy. And so they got that cubicle farm, or they got privacy. I do remember walking into offices like that and actually trying to find somebody. And I'm only 5'2". Just finding somebody was a challenge. Let's look back in that picture if I made it bigger for you. It just goes on forever. And that the word cubicle farm definitely looks like a farm. So I hope that wherever you work in your physical space, if you work at an office, that it looks something better than between the 1939 and the 1980s versus this cubicle farm look. And so really what they're trying to do is, how do we balance between that we and me? Really finding that balance between having public space and private space, and what best supports both collaboration and being your best, getting your most work done and producing. So in the study that was done in 1980, 85% of the people said that they needed spaces to concentrate without distractions, which brought us that cubicle farm. And more than half of them said they currently lack such spaces. And so these high-walled cubicles took over to provide more privacy. But of course, then, 10 or 20 years later, people are saying, ironically, 23% wanted even more privacy. So obviously they wanted an office versus a cubicle. But 50% of the people said they needed more access to other people, and 40% said they wanted more interaction. And so as a response to that, cubicles were replaced with more open spaces again. So you can see kind of this flip-flopping going back and forth in response to balancing kind of that we and me piece. And to me, this idea of activity-based working, which is, while it's not new, not a lot of, I would say, depending on where you are in the world, you might get more or less access to space like this, where you've taken that office space and added in team meeting or collaboration space, where you've added in just relaxation space where people can just, work in a little bit different environment. And then when you need to be on the phone, one of the things, I'm kind of a loud speaker. I used to be a teacher, so I have my people always say, Linda, you can take off your teacher voice, but I tend to project. And you've all sat near people that project loudly while they're on their phones, even if you're probably traveling in public spaces and you're listening to every word that's said. Not great. And so having space where you can be on the phone and have some privacy is important. And for the other people, they don't have to listen to you, as well as more of a focus or concentration space where you don't want to be interrupted. You want to be in one of these spaces in the middle where you can actually close off that space and have some space to yourself. And so this idea of activity-based working really was coming to fruition, I would say, right around the time the pandemic happened, which flipped everything again on its head. And so that's is where we really saw what I'm using the term now is remote working explodes. And we're going to talk about the different names for different working, but I'm using the word remote working as more of a generic term right now. And you can see in this picture, you've got people working side by side right next to somebody else who's on a call with another dozen people. And so one of the things you've heard me say this over and over again, but the pandemic really created a lot of opportunities to change. And one of the opportunities that the pandemic gave us was the opportunity to work away from the office and really get kind of slam down those rigid work structures that we had and trying to think about how can we be more flexible, more autonomous, and how can we empower our people to work more independently. Um, and in reality, it was forced on us for most of us that weren't working remotely at the time. Um, but it's really become, and I'll call it a not so quiet revolution because I've been posting jobs for ICOR in the past 2 years, and literally, if I say that remote working is part of the thing, I get 10 times the amount of applications that I get for someone who needs to be in the office. And so it's becoming an expectation that you'll have the opportunity to have a flexible workspace. And so that's why I say it's a not so quiet revolution. And it's changed how we manage our homes as well, having a place to work where we all had to scramble to find a place to work if you hadn't been working from home before, or if you live in an apartment, or if you live with extended family, trying to figure out where am I going to work from home um, has really become a less of an issue because we had this really abrupt forcing of us to change how we work. And technology advancements have really helped with that, as well as I really will say that those shifting societal values, this idea of wellness and taking care of yourself, as well as the fact that you need to take care of others, has really helped us to look at how we do this work. And so organizations that have adapted to those evolving needs of the workplace are finding themselves um, a place that people want to work, but it's still undergoing a transformative shift. And so while we're talking about it, I can tell you that many of you have probably experienced something very similar. That in September of 2024, all of a sudden companies, kind of like back to school time for those of us in the US or North America, that all of a sudden, okay, now you're going to have to be in the office 3 days a week. And these are the 3 days you need to be in the office, kind of arbitrarily. One of my friends had moved because she was hired as a 100% remote worker. That's what her job was. And all of a sudden, her boss decided, or her manager decided, that everyone needed to be in the office. Well, he had 12 people working for him, and 6 of those people no longer lived in the same city as the office because they were 100% remote. And he decided to make that change. And they're all looking for new work. And in fact, 2 of the people said they weren't coming back and they were just released. And so looking at how employers are managing this change is really, really interesting. And I think we're going to need a couple more years to get some data on the effectiveness of determining how companies make the decisions on who needs to work where and making those part of employment contracts as well. But it really remote work really provides us with some freedom or liberation from kind of that corporate culture where we all have to be in the same place at a certain time and follow these rules versus let's get our job done and let's do it well, but don't tell me exactly where it needs to be done or when it needs to be done. So just some interesting data from a study that was done by ViewSonic. Obviously, the term flexible work is what I'm trying to use now. I keep saying the word remote work because that's kind of how I've been saying it, but I really want you to think about this as more flexible work or flexible work arrangements and how those work arrangements can really be a benefit to manage yourself and your own work as well as how to manage the people that work with you. And what are some of those benefits? I just look at this picture here and it really explains my life. Um, when I had 4 kids home and I had to get them off to school, so I would start my day at 9 o'clock after I dropped the kids off at school at 8:30. Then I would pick them up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That would be the phase one of my day was over. So I worked from 9 to 3. And then after they went to bed, I would finish up whatever I had missed in emails or communications kind of between that 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock hour. And so I think a lot of people are in that position where they're trying to juggle being there for their family and for their kids, and maybe even saving some money on daycare, as well as all the commute time. If you live at where I live in the Chicago area, if you're going to work an 8-hour day and now you have to add 90 minutes at the front end and 90 minutes at the back end for your commute, it is a very, very long day. And to get that time back, which the pandemic gave us, really is something that people don't want to give up. So what do we mean by flexible work? There's really 8 categories, and some of these overlap. So kind of the hybrid work is the biggest picture, meaning um, it's going to give you that flexibility in terms of when the work is done and where the work is done. So it's looking at both the when and the where. Telecommuting has been in place forever. This is generally for people a description that people used for working outside the office or physical workspace. And the idea that you would come to the workplace when you needed to for meetings or work sessions, but the idea that the worker is generally close to the workplace so they can come in when they're needed, versus what I was saying with that remote worker, where it's really the same as telecommuting, except that your worker's far away, and so that might require more extensive travel to get there, so it would need to be planned more so. And then we're going to talk a little bit more too about the kind of the when to work, which is that condensed work week. I remember when I was in one of my first major jobs, I had gone to college for a couple years. I was taking a break to figure out what I wanted to do. And I was living between Chicago and Minneapolis, which is about a 7-hour drive or a 10-hour bus ride if you don't have a car. And so what I did is I did a condensed work week. I actually did a 3-day work week. I worked 12 hours a day. I worked Tuesday through Thursday, and then I commuted back to Chicago to see my friends and kind of hang out and figure out what I was going to do for college. And so we see that the condensed work week, you also see with people like firefighters and police officers. You even see it a lot in the medical fields for people that don't work a 12-hour day, 5 days a week. But this idea that you can get your work done in a more condensed time frame. This idea that you can have flex time, that you can choose when to work as long as you work the contracted hours. So for example, we have one of our employees works at the other whole part of the country than Chicago, and her work hours, literally, she likes to work from like noon to 8 o'clock at night on the West Coast time. And our arrangement is, as long as you're available for meetings on those days where we need to have meetings that aren't part of your work time, or to meet some sort of a deadline, that works for you. So being able to provide flex time as well, which kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, working in the middle of the day, maybe working early in the morning. I have another employee who has a bunch of little kids, and so she gets up and works from 5 to 7, works in the middle of the day, and then works after they go to bed again. So this idea to get the job done, as long as you're getting the work done, you have flex time to do that. Part-time work, we're all very familiar. It can be whether it's working 30 hours or less, or seasonal work. Obviously, you're also familiar with shift work, oftentimes used in that 24/7 environment. Usually it's 8-hour shifts or 12-hour shifts, as well as job sharing. And I've shared this before too, is I never would have left being a teacher if they had allowed me to work part-time and job share with another person, another teacher who we could have easily done that, but it wasn't 2024. It was a long time ago, and that just wasn't a possibility. So this idea of flexible work, these are kind of the main categories for that. So just some data. 21% is the amount of workers willing to give up some of their vacation time to get more flexible working options. That's giving you a message. 85% of the managers who believe that having teams with remote workers will become the new norm. So if that's the new norm, we're going to have to make sure that managers know how to manage people who don't work in the office space. This is going to become one of those pieces that companies really are going to have to put some policies and procedures around. Here you've got a really big number. 90% of the people believe morale could drastically increase if employers offer and implement flexible work options for all employees. We're going to talk about equity with policy as well. Notice the words options for all employees. 43% in the study that was done by GreatWorkLife.com said that they would consider flexible schedule the most significant benefit to their job. Think about that. That's above what you're making for your money. So let's look again at what a flexible working model looks like. We talked about kind of that hybrid working, which creates that balance between the office and remote work. Your role can be virtual, but understanding that sometimes certain activities are done in person. I don't necessarily believe that, but I do believe that we need to talk about it and decide which activities are better done in person, and that there needs to be agreement, because activities being done in person might work for some people, but not for everyone. And so I think versus making that blanket statement, that it's something that needs to be talked about within the group that you have. The main thing that people are I'll say managers are concerned about is that you're delivering results. And so making sure that you've got objectives and key results and KPIs, and that you've got a ways to measure productivity based on output and merit, that there's a lot of clarity in that versus the fact that you've clocked in, you know, with your timesheet or whatever, that you're sitting at your desk during these particular times. Also looking at how we can leverage technology to plan how and where to work. And so looking at goal-based planning and scheduling, which could be called smart planning. Also considering well-being, the fact that well-being is what keeps people engaged and what keeps people productive. And if their if the work environment is not helping with well-being, you're going to see people less engaged and less productive. And so really laying out there, what are resources and suggestions to ensure focus time, meeting limits and breaks. I'm sure if I asked you to raise your hand, you'd all raise your hands with being very frustrated with having meetings back to back to back to back to back and not even getting breaks in between. And even though you've maybe cleared your calendar and said you're not available, all of a sudden a meeting shows up on it. So as leaders, we need to be very cognizant of the well-being of our people as well. And then, of course, we don't want to forget agile working, you know, making sure that both culturally and operationally that we're prioritizing that client focus and that we're role modeling behaviors that drive more agile ways of working. And that's a whole topic all in itself. So we know that flexibility in the workplace has been a critical benefit for many workers. We've seen it, it's coming to be, and it's really changing because when workers are empowered to decide when and where they want to work, they've now just come to expect it. In fact, in a recent Work Monitor survey, they surveyed people in the United States, and they said 83% of those workers consider flexible working hours important. And then having flexibility in the location of where they work nearly as crucial for around 74%. So in actuality, this where to work is less important as the when to work, which was surprising to me. But having grown up, you know, having been able to be a mom who was also able to work full time, the flexible working hours as well as the location really made a difference. If I'd had to commute, the flexible hours probably wouldn't have helped me. And so we're going to look at flexible working with the lenses of where, when, and how work happens. So 9 out of 10 employees stress the importance of having control over their work location, irrespective of their job. So the where to work is very, very important. And they're not saying that they're choosing a particular place to work. They're saying they want to have some control over their work location. And then we talked about when work can be done. So employees value the ability to set their own schedules, with 3 out of 4, 75%, like we said, considering it a key factor in job acceptance. What I'm really interested is looking at 3 or 4 different studies. The data might have been off by a few percent, but you're still seeing um, the same big numbers and what people expect. And then how is that work completed? Empowering employees to shape their daily tasks enhances satisfaction and productivity. And just looking at what does that flexibility mean and how your work is done, um, enhance or not enhance the retention. So I'll give you a short story. A friend of mine, I think she's somewhere between 39 and 41 right now, but very much ADHD, has always been on medication ever since she was a young child, and needs that medication to work. And she was promoted um, to a significant manager position maybe 3 years ago, and found that she failed. Her ADHD made it very difficult for her to go from the job that she had, which was pretty much managing herself, to managing other people and having to manage teams and meetings and all of those things versus just taking care of the work that she got done. And then during the middle of all that, she was diagnosed with a chronic disease that kind of explained why she's been sick for all these years, and was put on some medication that made her actually more ill. And it was, I don't want to say luckily, but it was that diagnosis of the illness that actually got her out of that manager job, because she needed to vary the when the work was done, because she often didn't feel well enough to work. And so being able to organize that, and then at this complicating it even more, while she doesn't have children, she does have a father, and that father lived in Greece and was dying and needed her to come. So the where to work became Greece versus Chicago as well. And the biggest piece, the takeaway from this is what I wanted to share, was that she just got awarded the President's Award for her company. It's a very large global company. It's the top award that can be given, because when they took away the where, the when, and the how, and just let her do her job, she became the top producer in her company. And so this can be a really exciting outcome. And her story is one that needs to be shared, because she had a lot of challenges with just being, a good worker health-wise, as well as family-wise. And when she was given the flexibility with where and when and how that work was done, she became a top producer. And so that is where we need some time and some data to be able to get some information that then we can look at trends for what that looks like. But the real question that really is on the table is, to work remotely or not work remotely, and to what extent are you in both places or in either place? And I think it really gets down to having a choice. Is we just want to have a choice and not be told what it is what we need to do. And so before 2020, people really thought that was a choice rather than a necessity. And I think what you're going to see, and what you probably already feel for many of you, is that it is a necessity. You've changed how you work. You found that it's more productive, or you found that maybe working from the office is your choice, because working from home is too distracting. You can't focus. There's other people. So, but it's that choice that becomes really important. And what they found in the past was that people kind of self-sorted. So they gravitated to the option that best suited their personal circumstances, as well as their personality. As well as, like I would have said, certain times in my life working from, I might have actually wanted to work from the office just to get away from my home as well, and having that separation. So I don't want to be biased and say that working remotely or working at home is always the best way, because for many people it's not, but it's that choice that becomes part of the important aspect of this. And so one of the things I think companies really need to think about is that you need to be there with a purpose. Why, if you're a remote worker, why do I need to come from the office? Or under what circumstances, if I want to be in the office every day, under what circumstances should I be working from an alternate location, even if it's not my home? When TechSmith looked at some research that they did on flexibility trends early this year, they also found out the where to work was impacted by some variables that I thought were interesting. So your job role, managers think they should be managing people, and those people should be fully in the office. And therefore, managers, the expectation was that managers would be fully in the office compared to 27% of the rest of the company. And so many people feel that they're much more tethered to an office than more senior leaders or other people. The other thing that's come out is that some companies don't have any policies or guidelines on where people work. While they might have embraced the change, they haven't adopted new practices and processes. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Also, generations. I thought this was kind of interesting. Now, at my company, it isn't the age, it's more or less how long you've worked for us that determines what your choices are. And so here, that generation piece might be the fact that those older employees have the highest choice around where they work because they've also worked there the longest. But there also might be this tendency to think that, younger people aren't as reliable as older people, which I don't think there's any data to support that. But when they said that 74% of boomers can choose where they want to work versus 63% of the Gen Z, not a huge difference, but still a difference. And then company size was also curious that companies with more than 1,000 employees were more likely to allow hybrid work, which I also thought was kind of curious. I would like to see some other data on that. That was the only company or the only research I could find with data about company size. So you'll notice in this picture, we're talking about a hybrid option where you've got people sitting around a table meeting, and you also have people up on the screen that they're working virtually. And I can tell you, even at ISO meetings, international standards meetings, where we're writing standards, that this is becoming more and more the reality where we used to get hundreds of people coming to the in-person meetings twice a year. And this year we had our first one back and we had less than 100 people coming. And in fact, the leadership said, well, we're not going to have the virtual option because we want people to come. And all they did was lose the people who were going to attend virtually. They just didn't participate at all. And I think we have to consider participation and making sure people are involved and looking at what are the best ways to do that. So when we ask the question, why are large organizations more inclined to offer hybrid work? Well, one is they have more resources. They just have more people and they have more room space. They have more technology. They have ways to do it. Also, it's an attraction and retention piece for hiring. And so we know that flexibility is a highly sought after benefit, and larger companies often, again, have the resources to provide that. I often like this one, which is, we used to, in fact, for business continuity planning, oftentimes we would be talking about your alternate workplace. Well, we oftentimes don't even need that anymore because hybrid work experience prepares workers to work wherever they can. And so that has become, instead of it used to be the number one, what are we going to do if our workplace isn't available? Now you're like, yeah, our workplace isn't available, so we'll keep on going. This idea that in larger companies, you've got more role clarity, meaning like in smaller companies, you might be doing lots and lots of things, or you overlap with other people because there aren't as many of you to get the work done. These last two, or the innovation one and then the next one, I'm not so tuned into, but this idea that being distributed means you can be more innovative because you're able to hire more diverse people. I'm not certain about that. I oftentimes feel that when I need to be creative and innovative, I need my team right in the room with me, and we need to spend some time together versus trying to do it virtually. So I would argue that a little bit. Obviously, there's cost savings when you don't have to rent as much space. And then, of course, your environmental, social, or sustainable and governance goals of not having as many people using public transportation or driving their cars or having to heat or air condition as many buildings becomes part of that as well. So here is where I was going to sing for you. Working 9 to 5, what a way to make a living. But the fact is that it isn't the only way to make a living anymore. And so when we, again, saw another study that's saying flexible working options is a top priority, this desire for flexible working arrangements was all above 64%. And kind of the older that you got, the more you wanted that. And then as a top priority, again, the millennials came out on top. If you're talking about what is my very top priority for working at this company or my benefit, and that was having flexible working options. So it's not going away. The younger people are expecting it, and some of us older people, maybe could be talked into going back to the way it was, but I don't think we're going to get that from the younger workforce. So looking closely more at when, like we said, that actually gets a higher percentage of people than the where. And so 38% of people are still required to work traditional hours. And you can see again that 45% of those are the Gen X and Y. That only 37% have flexibility around those core hours. Again, the boomers get more opportunity for that than some of the younger people. 16% in this study had flexibility around which days they wanted to work. And really only 9% of the people in this study could work wherever they chose. And so when you're looking at schedule flexibility or the when to work, those companies that offered full choice found about 55% of them, the people chose hybrid, or 32% of them chose fully in office. So again, the in office is not going away because some people having a choice really want to be in the office. When you're looking at core days or core hours, only about 71% of the companies offered hybrid workers flexibility around their hours. But if you were in the office, only about 18% of the people offered that opportunity. And then around certain days, the hybrid worker again got more flexibility than the people in the office got about 21% of that flexibility. So it's interesting to see that where people work impacts when people work. And really the outcome of this is where companies have already decided that they're going to have flexibility in where they work, they're much more likely to also give flexibility when they work. So though, if you're looking for a job or if you're looking to add that, that's really the key answer here is that the two are going to go together. And so when you're compared to fully in-office employees, hybrid workers have over 4 times as much access to flexibility around their core hours, 3 times more access to flexibility in the days that they work, and over 70% more access to the full choice in where they work. So these are big numbers. And it all goes back to the base question about where they work. Moving to how they work. So when you talk about companies, about 2/3 of them have adopted a new where or when to work strategy, but only about 25% of those employees feel that their employers adequately supported them in changing how they work. And so when you're looking at, the hybrid way of working, when the light blue is the no, and the darker blue is the yes. So the question is that our teams have established norms to create clarity in how they'll work as a team. Only 26% of those. So when you're looking at having team members who aren't in the same place. Our managers are effective at managing distributed teams, only 25%. You'll see the data here is pretty consistent. Our organization has established norms to ensure that meetings are effective and inclusive, only 24%. And then our employees receive good training on best practices for remote or hybrid work. And that again is only 23% again. I don't know about you, but remote work and meetings, this is actually one of my kids and their spouse. And one of them said, I just had 3 virtual meetings and I'm exhausted. And the other one said, I don't have any meetings today. What am I going to do? So just motivated by different things and going back to this example where we have to be looking at people individually when we look at policy. And so you need to understand yourself as well is how do you like to work and how often you like interacting with others, which is going to impact kind of where and when you do your best work. And so even when you go back to that workplace design where you have the different places to work, And if you have a design like that and you go to the office, where is it that you like to get most of your work done? Where do you feel the most productive? And, you know, when you're having meetings, do you do better in in-person meetings or virtual meetings, which might help you make decisions on when you go to the office. Do you go when there's a lot of meetings, or do you want to avoid that and go when there's not a lot of meetings? So if you have choices and you have flexibility, the question then becomes understanding how you do your best work. This this piece of data I really didn't understand very much, but I thought I'd throw it up there just in case maybe you did. But this idea that the big picture takeaway here is you might not think virtual meetings are as effective, but what we do know is that they're usually good enough. And so the cost of time and money to get people to be in person, is it really worth it? And so those that require ground travel of less than 2 hours, you still had 6 people who wouldn't show up, but 50% of them still would only show up virtually, and 44% of them would be in person. When you look at those that require travel of greater than 2 hours, and again, ground travel, so I'm assuming public transportation or driving a vehicle, you had even greater numbers that said, that they would only show up virtually, which makes some sense. But if they require a domestic flight, it was interesting that those numbers switched. So that's when we look at the first two, the data makes some sense. But then the last two didn't. You would think that if you require international travel, which is going to be many more hours than you would think in a domestic flight, that you would think that those attending in person would drop way down. To see that it's just about the same as a domestic flight was surprising to me, and that those numbers weren't that much lower, I'm sorry, than the ground travel. So I guess it has to do with the time, really the time factor, and that people want to attend virtually, I think is the message that we get from this. But we do need some policies. People are asking for direction on what they need. So to reiterate, a lot of employers have embraced that where to work, but they haven't adopted new practices or processes to support it. And that's really where we're seeing a lot of the problems. So we need to have intentional ways that we implement our flexible ways of working so that it's very clear and everybody knows, I'll just say, knows the rules. Your policies are your rules. And what they found is that less than 25% of those people have established team norms or meeting norms, like we said, that have trained their managers in managing people they can't see day to day, how that they've trained their people on best practice or distributed teams, or really rethought the collaboration practices to ensure efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. It's changing how we collaborate and how we work together. So the key factor, if you take away one thing from all of this, is that whatever policies that you have, they need to be equitable and fair. If you're putting something in place, there needs to be those rules in place to ensure that what you're doing is fairly implemented. Because not everyone wants flexibility in where they work. And so giving those options is a way that you can have something for everyone. And depending on what your organization does, will determine the scope or extent of those options. But things like compressed work weeks, like I said, I was working, a 3-day work week. I got my job done. Everyone was happy. I would think that nowadays the job that I was doing was very independent, and there wasn't a lot of change, and I didn't need to interact with anyone. And so that worked. It might not work for everyone, but a lot of countries in Europe are already implementing the 4-day work week. And so it'll be interesting to see what kind of data comes out of that. Because one of the downsides of those compressed or 4-day work week is that people maybe are tired. Working 10 or 12 hours is a lot harder than working 8. And so what does that look like? Having those part-time work options, tying to job sharing, giving people time off in lieu of overtime, using that work on demand, which could be a contractor or a temp worker or somebody, that you use as a consultant. I also kind of like the fractional sick days, because if you're working from home, again, I bet I could get a large numbers of you that would raise your hands, that you're working from home when you're not feeling great. You're not well enough to go to work, but you're well enough to work from home, even if it's only checking your email and making sure there's no emergencies. So rather than having to take one whole PTO day, being able to take a part of a day would be something to consider. Also looking at unlimited paid time off. And as an employer, I was like, what? There's no way I would do that. And then I was talking with my son-in-law, who's a technology computer science person, and his company, everyone has unlimited time off or unlimited paid time off. And I was like, how does that work? And he goes, well, actually, he goes, I don't take any more time off than I did when I had 3 weeks. He goes, that's pretty much what I need. The thing about it is, though, that I have the flexibility of when I want to take them. So this idea of having floating holidays. We don't all have the same holidays, especially religious holidays, or when you have kids in school and they're off certain days. So being able to take your holidays when you need them versus when there's a set schedule for the office. I'm sure many of you love having summer or seasonal hours, where this is the most often where you have Fridays off or maybe a shorter work day. Also, people that have shift work, being able to shift swap on their own or self-rostering versus having to go through a process or bureaucracy for that. Again, having flexible break times if you're in a more maybe more of a union environment, about taking a break when you need it versus when it's on a schedule. My favorite thing I did when I was a teacher and I had my kids in childcare was I just would take a well-being day. I rarely get sick, so I'm very lucky about that, but I oftentimes needed a break. And so I would take a day off just to sit and do nothing, or to get my house cleaned or get my errands run or go to the doctor, whatever it was. But having a well-being day that I could take that was part of my PTO was really helpful. And in those days, if you were out sick, you had to actually say, like, you had to give personal information about why you were sick. I also think with so many boomers leaving the workplace that we need to look at gradual retirements. Instead of letting those people just walk out the door, having them move from 40 hours a week to 30 hours a week to 20 hours a week to being available when you need them. Kind of that work on demand piece where you can still call them when you need to. I think would be a smart move for companies to do with all the people that may be retiring in groups. I was just talking to a friend of mine that was, the whole department was getting a buyout, and I'm like, wow, and what are they going to do with that department? They're hiring all new people. I'm like, wow, everybody that knows anything, and this happened to be a business continuity space, everybody that knows everything is leaving. Good luck with that. Good luck with that moving forward. So when you're looking at some policies that you might need to consider, things like expense reimbursement policies are going to look different, like paying for Wi-Fi, for example, or security for your computer. How do you keep track of time for both regular employees and non-exempt employees? How do you manage rest periods and meal breaks? Looking at how you manage confidential information, data security. Most of that should have been resolved in 2020 and 2021, but you still need to have them. Your basic internet security policies. How do you manage your diversity, equity, inclusion when you're looking at flexible work, as well as your complaint and grievance procedure policies. Some of these things, your complaints might look different with more of a flexible workforce. Also, determine a strategy for maintaining office culture. We often think about office culture as something that you do in person. So how do you maintain or improve your office culture when people aren't all in the office? And how do you communicate those expectations? So making sure you have open channels of communications. We should have plenty of ways technology-wise to do that. Make sure that everyone, when I say all, have adequate and uniform access to regular performance feedback, because now if you're not seeing them every day, are they actually really working? So are you measuring their performance based on their output, or how often you, quote, see them? Looking at your performance criteria again across all your different populations, regardless of whether people are in front of you or maybe you only see them on a screen. Also looking at how do we make sure our documentation is uniform. So your information that you're managing is written down regardless of physical location. And I often laugh, all our water cooler conversations, some of those were not good conversations. A lot of times those were the gossip conversations. What I often say now is, and not to promote any particular technology, but your team's chat sometimes becomes that water cooler. or that conversation you have on the side when somebody's in a meeting and then you realize, oh, can they actually see my chats when they pull that meeting down? I'd be careful of that. But making sure that you're not losing those person-to-person communications, whether the people are in person or remote. So we need to make sure that we're collaborating. And when we have a remote or hybrid workforce, I keep saying remote and I should be saying hybrid, you need to make sure that you keep that collaboration going. So whether that collaboration, again, is in person, virtually, or a combination of that, a lot of people still believe that you can't fully collaborate unless you're in person. And so this is what's said here is as evidenced by research, but I would argue that we need some new research because we've had research that's based on 100 years of people working in person and face to face. Now we need to have some research on has our collaboration been impacted positively or negatively by having a hybrid workplace? What's interesting that even today, in 2024, 73% of employees say that they want more flexibility with work from home policies, but 67% of them also want more in-person collaboration. So it's the flexibility, it's not the mandate. It sounds like people don't mind going to the office, but they don't want to be told that they have to. So that they do value the in-person collaboration. And so one of the things that people are aware of is that when you're physically together, sometimes you can just get things done faster than you can when you're trying to get people to come to the same place or just to be more collaborative and more creative and innovative virtually. And I don't think we can give an answer to that. I don't think that this is an only answer. I think we need to learn more about how to do it more effectively, but we need to do it differently than how we've been doing it, because managing remote teams or a hybrid workforce is different than managing people face to face. So when you're looking at that, and I want to talk about diversity and inclusion more from a how we participate and collaborate point of view. And so how do you make sure that your collaboration is inclusive? And I've noticed I'm sure the rest of you have noticed that sometimes, yeah, I'm going to pause that question for a second because I think I talk about it next, but when you have a virtual meeting, you need to use the chat or have some kind of an indicator of when they'd like to speak. That doesn't happen here on this webinar because we have you silenced, but any other meeting, raising your hand, putting a note in a chat, whatever it is, there needs to be a way for people to take their turns. Instituting some sort of a round robin where everybody has a dedicated time to share. This is really important too when you have international groups and people that maybe you're having a meeting in English and not everybody have a primary language in English, but even culturally, even if everyone is an English speaker and your meeting's in English, not everybody, people are shy. So even if you're in person, you need to use that sort of thing and give people time. I think that when we're in person, we sometimes are able to look around the room and we can give people time, but when we're on a virtual, people get scared because there's quiet. Oh, somebody needs to talk. I only keep talking during this time because none of you have the opportunity to talk, and we don't really want a lot of white quiet noise during a webinar. But when you're having a collaborative meeting, you need to give people time to think. And even stating that up front, we're going to do 3 minutes, and then let's rejoin, and I want you to share what you've been thinking, or whatever that appropriate time amount is. But one of the things that we do know is just like in in-person meetings where you can give somebody the look and say, stop talking, you're talking too much, you're taking up more space than you need to. We have the same thing in Zoom. And I'm using Zoom here as a generic, virtual meeting platform. Some people just can't stop talking, or others don't say anything. And so figuring out how to be inclusive in that collaboration time is really, really important. And so that's why the hand raising, having somebody who's leading the meeting, be in charge of deciding who's going to talk when, is also important. And so you have to not only get the whole team involved, but also shut the people up who are saying too much. And so ask yourself, who's speaking? Who am I seeing having the power in this meeting? How is that power being used? Because even there are people who continuously interrupt because they're tired of waiting for you to call on them and you're intentionally not calling on them. And so how do you manage some of those people? Also, it's a lot easier to spot body language in person, but the fact is that you can do it on screen. You can see people disengaging when they're looking away or looking down or when they shut their camera off. And so what is your requirement for being on screen? It is difficult to be on screen hour after hour after hour after hour. And sometimes, like for example, I actually can't do a webinar with sharing my screen because I have, in my mind, it's hard for me to focus on the presentation if I'm also thinking about what do I look like. And that just might be me, but I know people have asked for that in the past. And for me, I would rather do a better job on the webinar than be looking at how I look. And some days you don't look great. And so, I've been in meetings before where I'm saying, I'm only going to share my screen when I have something to say. Otherwise, I'm going to share off screen. So whatever those rules are, understanding that body language and making sure that people are comfortable enough to share that. Just to quickly finish up, I wanted to make sure that we talked about kind of the role of the community. And so I-Corps does have a community resilience framework that has brought together a lot of the, well, I would say all of the aspects that the research has shared on what makes communities more or less resilient. And we have these 5 dimensions, or we call them environments, really. That healthy environment, so where you're living is a place that's healthy to live in. It's not poisoning you, like we've had some in the United States where the water is poison, or you've got conditions where a factory or whatever is there, but you also have responsible governance. You've got an economy that benefits your business, that you have a quality of life where people would like to live in that community, where they have access to what they need to live at high quality life, as well as that your community is prepared for some sort of a disaster. So when we look at having, what are some of the natural disaster community capabilities, things like services that protect its community members. It's in a healthy environment. You're not going to be flooded or have wildfires or whatever it is that might impact your environment. That your community is funding risk reduction activities and that they're planned and funded. That community members are educated on how to be more prepared. And organizations are recognized for their resilience initiatives. Just, having a way to people to recognize organizations that are more prepared than others. And we're looking at financial stability, so having access to financial and physical resources, having a diversified economy versus a company town, where you maintain the value of your currency. You're producing the necessary resources that you need to continue up for your community to continue to function. That you're actually meeting your own finances and budgets under these changing conditions, and that the people have access to employment and prosperity. Kind of social well-being, access to affordable housing and healthcare, access to education and information, access to employment and prosperity again, having the existence of social freedoms, where you can enforce laws humanely, protecting your community members, having community services available like transportation and internet. I can tell you the community that I live in, about 40% of the time doesn't have internet. We still don't have it here. We have to purchase it through satellite. We don't have access. And having those networks and partnerships to provide support in times of need. So to kind of finish up, workplace design really needs to be tied to the work being done and the balance, that we and me piece that continuously becomes a challenge. You need a flexible working model for the future, and I'm just going to say you need it right now. When you're looking at collaboration, you really need to look at how are you managing inclusion as part of that collaboration with different people you have working different ways, and looking at how you consider the resilience of your communities and how that impacts your workplace resilience. We will share the resources when you get your certificate. I don't see any questions right now, but if you want to have any as we're kind of finishing up the last slides, I'd be happy to take them. Just a reminder that you can become a leader in resilience by taking our courses and earning our certifications. that this is the complete series. So if you've missed any, feel free to check our YouTube page or check our website under webinars, and you'll be able to access those as well. And contact us to learn more. Appreciate your attending, and we'll see you again in 2025.